Hello, this is Chiak. Hello, this is Chiak. Is it actually live or? Okay, it's live. Hello, this is Chiak. We are back with the Dead Space Catalyst Cold Read. So this is going to be a continuation of part 1, chapter 5 to 8. This looks like it's going to be a bit of a shorter reading. Let's call it a reading session, I guess. And once again, a rating. It's a cold read, so this is the first time I'm reading it. So there are going to be stumbles, there are going to be mistakes, la da la da la di da. Either way, get started. Dead Space Catalyst, Part 1, Chapter 5. Jency grew. He was admitted to university off-world, back on Earth, but couldn't afford to go. Instead, he studied at the technical college in the colony there. He studied computers, learning some solid programming skills, and, on the side, improved on the hacking his brother had taught him. He might have gone into computers if he hadn't become interested in piloting. Henry, whose grades weren't quite as good, but whose parents had more money, did go off-world, and Jency figured that was the last of him. That he probably wouldn't hear from him again. But in a year, Henry had flunked out and was back on Vindaga, at the technical college as well. I'm the family failure, he claimed to Jency. They can hardly stand to look at me, which made Jency wonder if he was at fault for whatever had gone wrong with Henry. Perhaps he had ruined him by distracting him, giving him hints of a different, stranger life. Jency never went back to the house, but he still walked sometimes through the Mariner Valley compound, hoping to catch a glimpse of his brother, gaining some reassurance from the familiar griminess of the hoping to catch a glimpse of his brother, gaining some reassurance from the familiar griminess of the streets. Then one day, that was gone. Then one day, that was gone too, carried away in the public works effort to clean up the compound. For a few days, the streets stayed clean, the smell of disinfectant replacing the stench of trash, but quickly they began to revert to what they were before. Several times, while walking through one part of the city or another, Jency thought he caught a glimpse of his brother, hair-crazed and overgrown, shambling. But he rarely managed to catch up with these apparitions, and the few times, 3 or 4 years went by with Jency moving forward with his life. At first he thought often of Istvin, but as time went on he thought of him less and less. He could go for days without thinking of him at all. He managed to finish his associate's degree in flight and cargo manipulation, and would have gone on to complete his bachelor's if the planetary government hadn't cut school funding. When that happened, he moved out of his foster family's home, took a small apartment near Vindauga. Man, I'm saying this. Dauga. Took a small apartment near Vindauga Space Hub and began to work. He was a picker, working every time a ship bearing supplies came in. His job was to help crew a surface-to-atmosphere ship that would meet the huge cargo ships that came into orbit, transferring a fraction of the load from one ship to the other over and over again until the that came into orbit. Transferring a fraction of the load from one ship to the other over and over again until the cargo. They were busy building an orbital docking station, and he wondered if this wouldn't eventually make his job obsolete. For a while, Henry did the job as well, but the moments of near weightlessness proved too much for him. He went back into training on his family's money, preparing for first one surface-based job and then another. Picking either was very busy or very slack, never simply steady. He was either working 16-hour shifts, or lying idle in his apartment, scrolling through something on the vid screen. Was it the life he had dreamed of? No, but it was better than any life he probably would have had if he ended up staying in the Mariner Valley compound. He met a woman, a little shorter than him, and slightly plump and somewhat neurotic. He saw her for a while and then broke it off. Then he met another, long-legged and a little taller than him, generous and kind, whom he liked much better. But he managed to sabotage the relationship despite that. He was leery of getting involved, leery of establishing new ties, remembering the hell that had been his family growing up. He wondered if he should see someone, a psychiatrist, a specialist. Maybe they could help him. But he didn't know who to see, where to start looking. It could have gone on a long time, maybe even for a whole life, but it didn't. For one simple reason. The reason was Istvan. Nearly 4 years after his brother had suddenly disappeared, Jensi was on a long pick, 36 hours solid, clearing out a freighter on overtime. He would catch a little sleep here and there on the trip up and down, but not enough to be exhausted by the time the pick was finally over. When he went home, he found his apartment unlocked. Weird, he thought, but shook it off. Figured he'd been called away on the pick on short enough notice that he simply made a mistake and forgot to lock the door. Inside, nothing seemed to be out of place or missing, either in the living room or the bedroom. But when he went into the bathroom, turned on the lights, shucked off his clothes, and pulled back the shower curtain to climb in, there was Istvan. "Hello, brother," Istvan said, and offered his flat, dead smile. At first, Jensi thought he was much more tired than he realized, that he was hallucinating. But no. After screaming and stumbling back into the wall, he found Istvan reaching out and steadying him, stepping out of the tub, undeniably real. "What are you doing here?" Jensi asked, heart still thudding. "I came to see you," claimed Istvan. He had cut his hair short, in a crew cut, and was clean-shaven. His right cheek was marred by an angry red scar, puffy and relatively fresh. Jensi could feel something strange about one of the hands steadying him. It was only when Istvan let go that he realized it was missing 2 fingers. "How did you find me?" asked Jensi. "I always knew where you were," said Istvan. "I've been watching over you." Watching over me, Jensi thought, and shivered. He pushed Istvan gently away and slipped back into his clothes. "Why were you hiding in the bathroom?" he asked once they were in the living room. How did I know it was you?" Istvan asked. "It could have been someone else. It could have been them." Jensi nodded. He wasn't sure what to say or what to do. Did he really want to see his brother at all? But already the weird mixture of guilt and affection that he thought he'd managed to eradicate years ago was beginning to well up within him. The unhealthy bond with his brother was already starting to form again. "You can't stay here," he managed to say. "I don't want to stay here," Istvan said. "I have a purpose now." "What do you mean, a purpose?" Istvan smiled and shook his head. "It's my purpose, not yours," he said. "It's for me to know." Jensi ran his fingers through his hair. "Why are you here?" he asked. "I wanted to see you again," said Istvan. "One more time before fulfilling my purpose." "What's that supposed to mean, fulfilling my purpose? What are you on about?" But Istvan just smiled flatly again. "You look well," said Jensi. "You look tired," claimed Istvan. "I am tired," said Jensi. "I'm exhausted." He tried again. "What do you mean by your purpose?" "They told me not to tell." "Who told you?" "They." Who's they? Suddenly, Istvin giggled. He pressed his hand over his mouth to stop himself, but he couldn't help giggling through it. What's wrong, Istvin? Jensi asked, trying to keep his voice as calm as he possibly could. Istvin giggled again, then closed his eyes. He sat there on the couch, trying to breathe slowly, until finally, the giggles stopped entirely. Then he slowly moved his hand away and opened his eyes. There, he said. See, everything is all right. There is nothing wrong with me. I don't know what you're planning, said Jensi. Whatever it is, don't do it. There is nothing wrong with me, said Istvin again, but this time it sounded more like a question. Istvin, Jensi said, but Istvin was already standing. I have to go, he said. I just wanted to see you first. Before your purpose, said Jensi. Before my purpose, he said, and smiled. He walked almost drunkenly to the door, turning around just as he got there. I'll be on the vids tomorrow, he said. All the vids. Watch for me. I'll be famous. And then he was gone. He's crazy, thought Jensi. Certifiable, just like Mother. His brother had been going on about some imagined encounter he had, some delusion of glory and fame that he'd invented for himself, which would amount to nothing. His brother had re-entered his life for a brief, somewhat painful moment, and now he was gone again. Maybe for good this time. I should be thankful he's gone, Shensi told himself. He's nothing but trouble. But he wasn't thankful. Instead, despite being exhausted, he found himself having difficulty sleeping. What had his brother been talking about? His purpose. What if it did mean something? He turned over and tried to ignore the thoughts. He closed his eyes and lay there watching little bursts of imagined light flicker over his eyelids. He tried all the tricks he could think of to coax himself to sleep. Counting sheep, even though he had never seen actual sheep. Thinking through a math problem mentally. Repeating to himself the same rhythmic phrase over and over again. Trying to imagine the weight of his body growing heavier and heavier and falling asleep limb by limb. But nothing worked. There, beneath the exhaustion he was feeling, like an inhuman baleful eye, was his worry about his brother sleeping. He kept trying to fall asleep, until finally he felt like he was going mad. Then he got up, vidded Henry. Do you know what time it is? Henry asked, his face and hair scruffy through the vid. All too well, said Jensi. I couldn't sleep. So you thought you'd wake me up and make it so neither of us could sleep? He yawned. Istvan was here. What? Said Henry. Really? You mean you dreamt about him? Jensi shook his head. He was really here, in the flesh. I thought by this time he was probably dead, said Henry. What did he want? He wanted to see me one last time. One last time for what? Jensi explained the little he knew. He's crazy, right? He asked once he was finished. Maybe, said Henry slowly. I don't know. Maybe he's planning to do something. What? Henry shrugged. I don't know, he said. Something drastic, maybe. Like what? What's he capable of? Asked Henry. I know you love him, then that he's your brother, but you remember how he was when we first found him? He might have killed us. If he's in the right mood, or the wrong one, I guess, I think he's capable of anything. A bomb, maybe? A bomb? Said Jensi. You've got to be kidding. It could break one of the domes, put everyone at risk. It doesn't have to be a bomb, said Henry. Anything happening tomorrow. Like what? A speech, a rally, some sort of protest march, a meeting of two officials. Something along those lines. I don't know, said Jency. I've been picking. I haven't been following the vids. Have you noticed anything? Henry shook his head. I don't think so. If there is, maybe he's planning to disrupt it. He claimed he was going to be on the vids? That's what he said. Henry shrugged. Look through the vids notice. See what's happening tomorrow. We can try to figure out, stake a plate. Watch the vids for something that seems likely, and then, if we find it, try to make it there before he does. Jency cut the link and tried to sleep. Again, without success. He lay there, staring up into the dark until, slowly, the room began to brighten. Then he got up and began scrolling through vid notices. A school was being opened, someone from the colonial authority coming to cut the ribbon. There was a press conference on the steps of the municipal hall run by a politician named Tim Fisher about a methane leak in one of the outlier domes, and to what degree, if any, the government was responsible. A political rally from the opposition candidate David Vernaglia held not far from the municipal hall. An ambassador from EarthGov named Jedro? Sorry, that is a very different name. An ambassador from EarthGov from Jedro Berry, landing at the spaceport. There were other things mentioned, but they seemed less likely. The revamping of a new low-income housing project, the demolition of a now deserted microdome, etc. If it was anything, it was probably one of those 4 vets. Which one? Henry would help him, but that still meant they could only cover 2. School ribbon cutting, press conference, political rally, ambassador, and any of them might be what he was looking for. A place for Istvan to be visible, to be seen on vid while he did whatever he planned to do. Was he likely to be violent? Crazy? Yes. Jency had to admit either of those things were possible, even likely. Would he try to hurt someone? Kill someone? Would he try to kill himself? All possible. But it was equally possible that his purpose, whatever he meant by that, might be something else entirely. Something relatively benign. Maybe he would throw a pie at the ambassador, or maybe he would take his pants down at the press conference and moon the crowd. He tried to tell himself that Istvan was doubtless capable of those sort of things too. Though Jency knew he was fooling himself. That violence was most likely. And what? Suddenly worried Jency, still exhausted, his eyes throbbing in his sockets, a migraine just beginning to create an aura in front of one that he knew would travel across his vision until it filled both eyes and then dissolved into pain. What if Istvan, in saying he was on the vids, was not referring to some event or occurrence that he was going to hijack, but to the fact that whatever he did, wherever he did it, it would be featured on the news after the fact, that he would be famous by having fulfilled his purpose? What if it wasn't that he was going to borrow the celebrity of an event, but that he was going to make his own fame by doing something rash? If that was his plan, he could do that anywhere. If that was the case, there was no way to find him until it was done, until it was too late. The next 6 hours were the worst Jency had ever lived. The most anxious, the most exhausting. Until close to the time of the events themselves, there was nothing he could do. He just had to wait, all the while trying to guess which might be the most likely place to find his brother. Trying to ignore the fact that his brother might not be at any of the events he'd keyed on. He kept imagining Istvan strapping himself into a jacket with sticks of explosives sewn on the inside of it, or his brother suddenly appearing out of the crowd, running toward the steps or the platform, or the security guard brandishing a knife. He was worried, both that his brother would kill someone and that, trying to do something foolhardy, his brother would be killed. He didn't know for certain which was more likely. In the middle of the morning, Henry showed up and together they talked things through. "Does he care about politics?" asked Henry. "He didn't used to," said Jency. Now who can say? I haven't seen him in years." "His purpose," he said. "Was there a way he said it? A particular way he phrased it? Did it sound political to you? Religious?" Jency shook his head. "It didn't sound like anything. It just confused me." "Let's try to think," said Henry. "There are only two of us. We can only cover two things. We have to narrow it down." Jency nodded. "Or we could call the police," said Henry. "Tell them there's been a threat on the two that we can't cover." That might make things worse. For who? For Istvin? Certainly it won't make things worse for whoever he might hurt. Jency shook his head. "No," he said. "He'd see it as a betrayal. I can't do it." "You may have to do it," said Henry. You don't want anybody's death on your conscience. It could lead to his death, to Isfin's. I don't want his death on my conscience either. I don't want to do it." Henry just looked at him with a steady eye. "Only as a last result," Jensen finally said. "All right," said Henry, and sighed. "Only as a last result." "Political rally seems likely," said Henry. "How about that?" "I don't know," said Jency. "I'd think so, but since it's for the opposition candidate, I'm not so sure. They always supported the underdog, but maybe he's changed." "So possible, but maybe not likely. What about the school ceremony? Does he have anything against education?" "He didn't want me to join my foster family," said Jency. "School might be tied into that for him, something that he feels separated us." "But it's a new school opening," said Henry. "Not a school that you went to. I know his mind is broken, but as a symbolic gesture, it doesn't amount to much." "His mind is broken?" thought Jency, and then thought, yes, Henry's right. "Someone on the Colonial Authority is cutting the ribbon," continued Henry. "Is it anybody he knows?" "Who is it?" They looked at the vid notice. "It doesn't say," said Jency. "No way to tell without going." "Even then, we probably won't know," said Henry. "Who knows what he's been up to or who he's met over the last several years. Still, not likely. What about the ambassador from Earthglove? What's his name?" He scrolled through the vid until he found Jedro Berry. "Name ring a bell?" Jency shook his head. "All right," said Henry. "That's okay. Doesn't mean anything. He's a representative of EarthGov Authority. That might be enough." He sighed. "Basically, nobody seems all that likely. Nobody's jumping to the top." They sat across from one another in silence until, finally, Jency said, "So what do we do?" "Do? We draw straws." Jency felt like he was going mad, his mind straining to see a connection that either wasn't visible or simply wasn't there. He felt like Isfin, always searching for a pattern, trying to see something that nobody else could see. How would Isfin think? He wondered, his head throbbing. He tried to put himself in the place of his brother, tried to remember the erratic way he had responded to those situations that had seemed clear and straightforward to Jency, but they were all moments from childhood, and even thinking back on them, he could neither understand them nor extrapolate them into something relevant to the present situation. He had long understood that something was seriously wrong with the way Isvin viewed the world, as if he were seeing everything through a different lens than everyone else, a dark and smoky lens that distorted everything and made it false. But how could Jency, more or less normal, simulate that way of seeing the world? Solemnly, Henry took 4 scraps of paper and wrote a word on each one: rally, press, school, port. Then he folded each into a small square and jumbled them in one hand. Do you want to choose first, or shall I? He asked. Jency reached out, took a piece of paper from Henry's hand. Open it, Henry said. You go first, said Jency. Henry closed his eyes, felt among the pieces of paper, chose one. Together they opened them. School, said Henry's. Port, said Jency's. Henry reached out, placed his hand on Jency's shoulder. Good luck, he said, and they both laughed. Six. Commander Groder stood at the helm, hands clasped behind his broad back. There was nothing about his stance to suggest that he was anything but relaxed, but within his head the thoughts spun back and forth. He knew altogether too little about the project to be comfortable. He was not sure exactly what he was getting into. He turned and looked behind him. There on the bridge, to one side, was a technician named Jane Haley. She was young, fairly fresh of the academy, but smart and ambitious. He had seen her scores off the charts and read the reports on her and chosen her. Indeed, the whole crew was handpicked by Groder. Excellent crew, notable as well for being willing to follow commands to the letter and for their unquestioning loyalty. Though he had chosen Ensign Haley's precisely because she was not like that, because she might stand up to him when the others would not. On the other side of Groder was Ensign Eric Arthur, a thin and tubercular man who was the only person that Groder hadn't chosen as part of his crew. Blackwell had insisted on him, which made Groder wonder if Blackwell trusted him. He'd done what Blackwell and the 2 somewhat odd men he'd introduced him to had asked of him, but perhaps Blackwell still had his doubts as to his loyalty. Groder was a good commander, inflexible in his own way, but smart enough to get out of scrapes when he needed to. And working for Blackwell, he often needed to. Arthur, too, was a unitologist. That was fine. Groder technically was too, but in name only. It had been one way up the promotion ladder, and he had joined because it was expedient at the time. He didn't believe in it exactly, but he'd seen enough of the footage and records from Michael Altman's time to know that there had been power to the marker. Blackwell, too, he imagined, wasn't much of a believer. Maybe he wasn't even a unitologist at all. But he saw the potential for power as well. And those orders, the ones who went unnamed but seemed really to be the ones in charge, he'd met them only once. But once had been enough. Yes, he knew too much about the project to be comfortable. He was to locate a planet for a secret facility that would allow for the continuation of the marker project. What all the specifics of that continuation would be, he didn't know. But the fact that they wanted to make sure the planet was uncharted, away from the usual trade routes and far from civilization, told him it wasn't good. With Blackwell, he had chosen several likely planets, but had rejected them one after another. The last on the list they were approaching now. It was one Blackwell had hesitated over for some reason, but had finally said yes, go ahead. It was listed as uninhabited, no breathable atmosphere, but Earth-like gravity. They had approached it and circled around it, and had been surprised to find signs of life. A small colony of some sort, completely enclosed. It was small enough that he'd almost missed it, but Haley, with her sharp eyes, had caught it. Except for the planet was Except for that, the planet was perfect. He double checked. It wasn't in any records. They were legal. Do we recommend it, sir? Asked Haley. No, said Gorder. A colony, even an illegal colony, wasn't possible. Who knows what connections they might have to other people in other places. And when someone might come looking for relatives they had down there, no, it wasn't secure. So what do we do then? Asked Haley. Gorder shrugged. We keep looking, he said. When the vid sounded, it was one of the two men Blackwell had introduced him to, the one with cruel eyes and grayish skin. He cut right to the point. I hear you rejected Aspera, he said. Care to explain? There's an uncharted colony there, said Garter. It won't do. The man shook his head. It's not a colony, he said. No, said Garter. Then what is it? A containment facility. We have a share in it. Apart from that, Commander, is everything else about the planet up to specification. Specification. He referred to Haley's notes, gave a rundown to the man. Yes, everything did seem to be right. Everything else was fine. Then we'll move forward, said the man. You're to contact Tim Fisher on Vindauga. He's one of us and very discreet. He supervises the shipping for the containment facility. He'll arrange to have building supplies shipped out. Ostensibly for the containment facility, but in actuality for you. He looked more closely at Garter. His eyes narrowed. What's wrong? He asked. Nothing's wrong, Garter said. You can speak freely, claimed the man. It seems like a risk factor, Garter said. Word of the project could get out through them or the guards in the facility. In addition, there's a risk of what might happen if the project goes awry and there's an outbreak. They're prisoners, and they're in a secret containment facility, said the man. Yes? That means they're expendable, the man simply said. Garter nodded curtly. Besides, said the man, we might need human subjects. For a moment, Garter was silent. Then, yes, sir, he finally replied. Seven. No, thought Jency on the way over. The rally's more likely. I should go there. But it was only more likely, he realized. If it were he rather than Isvin doing the thinking. Stick with the plan, he told himself. But when he reached the port, he found that the EarthGov ambassador's arrival was delayed, there having been a problem with the surface skimmer that had met his ship. There was hardly a crowd, only a dozen people, most of them there in an official capacity. He scanned over them quickly, looking for Isvin's face, but wasn't surprised not to find it. There was still time. If he hurried, to go to one of the other sites, rally or press conference, he asked himself. Which one? Both were roughly in the same direction. He started to run. He went down the wrong alley and got turned around, rooted back in the other direction, but he realized his mistake quickly and worked his way back out. He was running faster by now, but still unsure where he was going. One or the other. Which was the closest? The rally, but not by much. He could already hear the sound of it, the echo of the loudspeaker, the words so distorted that he couldn't begin to make them out. He cut through a back alley and came out on the main avenue, and suddenly there he was, on the fringes of a crowd. On a platform down near the end of the street, David Vernaglia had just begun to speak. his voice booming from speakers all around the crowd. Gensi pushed his way forward, looking for his brother. Now, I wouldn't say that the current administration is doing a terrible job, said Vernaglia. But then again, I don't have to say it, because you already know it. You wouldn't be here if you didn't. The crowd erupted into applause and shouts. Gensi pushed further in, the people he pushed shoving back, giving him dirty looks. As he got closer, the crowd got tighter. He stood on his tiptoes and tried to peer around them, looking for his brother in the sea of faces. It was hopeless. Too many people. Now what? He wondered. Did I make the wrong choice? Vernaglia was still talking, really getting the crowd going now. Vernaglia was, at least, still alive, and the rally hadn't been interrupted by anyone, which probably meant that this was the wrong place to be. Was there still time to make it over to the press conference? He pushed his way sideways through the crowd, ignoring the complaints of the people around him. If he could get to the edge, he could go back down the alley he'd come out of and take back streets to the press conference. It was worth a try. And then he noticed a man in a black suit pushing through the crowd at a little distance behind him, speaking into a headset. Some official, part of the candidate's security force probably. Another was there to his left, deeper in the crowd, but waiting his way as well. Maybe my brother's here after all, he thought, and glanced around a moment for him, before suddenly realizing that no, it wasn't Istvin they were moving toward, but him. Suddenly he realized how he must have looked, pushing his way into the crowd, causing ripples, forcing his way toward the front, then swerving away, going sideways again. Oh my God, he thought. They think I'm a threat. The man behind was slowly gaining on him. The one to the side was in a thicker part of the crowd and was having a little more difficulty. If he started pushing and running, Gensi knew they'd be on him all the more quickly, and people in the crowd would probably start trying to catch hold of him as well. As long as he didn't panic, didn't give the game away, he hoped the two security guards would stay at the same pace, trying to slowly gain on him, but not wanting to panic the crowd. He kept moving roughly sideways, doing his best to follow the quickest, most open path. And then suddenly, he saw his chance. A path opening up in two directions and a large, tall man there in front of him. He ducked and scooted around him, striking the man's left leg as he did so, following the tightest of the path, but moving as quickly as he could and as far as he could, while still trying not to jar or knock the people in front of them and give his location away. He risked a glance backwards and saw that the man he had struck in the knee on the way past had turned and bent to feel his leg, and doing so, effectively blocked the path. He could only go maybe 3 meters before the crowd thickened up again, but he hoped that would be enough. He stayed crouched and hunched over and out of sight for a moment, and then carefully raised his head, peering over the shoulder of the man behind him. He could only see one security guard, but the one he could see was stationary, staring all around him, trying and failing to catch sight of him. Gensi moved just a little and caught sight of the other one. The man had crossed over Gensi's path without seeing it, and was pushing toward the back of the crowd, scanning the people around him carefully, but never looking back over his shoulder. Keeping his head down, Gensi began pushing forward again. More gently this time, trying not to attract the attention of the two security guards. In a few moments, he was in a less populated section of the crowd. A few meters more, and he had darted down the alley and was away. The press conference was only 3 or 4 meters away. The rally must have been set up where it was partly to disrupt it and negate the colonial government's attempts to smooth things over. But that was enough time for Gensi to realize that there was something he had overlooked. That maybe there had been a reason to favor the press conference over the other option after all. He remembered the strange moment when his brother and he had come across the children playing near the crack in the dome, daring one another to get close. Remembered, too, Istvin's obsession with the crack when Isvan had rushed at the crack and struck the dome hard enough with his forehead to bloody it. The press conference was about a crack in a dome. That wasn't much of a connection, but it was the only connection he'd been able to come up with so far. His heart was beating fast by this time, and he was short of breath. He ran along the street until he figured he'd passed the last of the rally, then cut back toward Luna Avenue. There, just a few hundred feet away, was the Municipal Hall. It was a much smaller crowd than the rally, the merest fraction of the number of people. Still, the steps were crowded, perhaps close to 100 people, though as many people seemed to be looking back toward the rally as toward the man fielding questions up on the steps. Not wanting to be conspicuous, he slowed his run to a quick walk, then slowed further still. He drifted into the edge of the crowd and stopped and waited. "No," said Councilman Tim Fisher, frowning. He stood flanked by two security guards, their faces expressionless. The government can hardly have teams of wandering assessors moving from dome to dome, reporting on the integrity of each structure. We simply can't afford it. Jency looked around. A first sweep didn't reveal his brother. But, said a reporter, perhaps the same one who had asked whatever the initial question was, "How can you afford not to?" Fisher remained unruffled. "We can afford to do a little of it," he said, apparently thoughtfully, "but we do not have endless resources, and so we have to focus them. As much as most of you know, we do have a team for the dome we are in today. We felt that this dome, as the largest dome, should be a priority." Jency kept scanning the crowd, more slowly this time, moving from face to face. "It was also the richest dome per capita," stated another reporter. "That's besides the point." "But the poorer domes are not a priority," said the second reporter. "That's exactly the point." "It is a sad thing," said Councilman Fisher, "but we do have to make choices. We depend on citizens to let us know when they see signs of stress or potential indications of failure. Whenever they let us know, we do our best to correct the problem as quickly as possible. In this case, it's not a governmental failure that's the problem. It's a failure on behalf of the citizenry. They should have been on this sooner." A dull, dissatisfied rumble moved through the crowd, people turning to one another and whispering, and in that moment Jency caught sight of Isvan. He was mostly hidden behind a large, middle-aged woman on the other side of the crowd, near the top of the steps, close to the councilman. He was standing motionless, his head down, and remained that way even when the people around him were turning to one another to discuss something the councilman had said. But Jency could tell by the tension of his neck and shoulders that he was as tautly wound as a spring. Isvan was waiting for a sign, something that would tell him when to go, what to do next. He already knew what he would do. They had taught him. They had given him his purpose, and he explained to him what would happen when he did it. How funny it would be. But the question now was when. And they were not the ones that could tell him that. The world... I feel like I should be reading this differently. Sorry. Isvan was waiting for a sign. Something that would tell him when to go, what to do next. He already knew what he would do. They had taught him. They had given him his purpose and explained to him what would happen when he did it. How funny it would be. But the question now was when. And they were not the ones that could tell him that. The world around him had to be the one to tell him that. A voice had to come to signal to him, to show him its pattern and shape and draw him forward. They had suggested to him that there was no reason to hesitate. He had a purpose, and so as soon as he saw his opportunity, he should spring forward. But no, he was almost seeing a pattern, but wasn't quite there yet. Something was missing. Someone had not felt it yet and was standing wrong. The lines could not be traced. The shadow man remained hidden, unspeaking, or something else was just slightly out of place and needed to be adjusted. And yet it was not his task to adjust the pattern. No, his task was only to see it, and once he saw it, to let it call him forward to his purpose. He would wait as long as he had to. Patience, he told himself. Patience. The man in front of him spoke on, answering questions, but in ways that made no sense to Istvin. He pretended to be listening, but he was not listening. He was watching and waiting. In his head, he was saying the numbers, calling the pattern forward, reminding himself, and his voice, he realized now, was mumbling too. Not too loud, not loud enough to be heard. But if the pattern did not come soon, he would, he knew, get louder and louder still. And then he caught out of the corner of his eye a flicker of motion, and the pattern slipped into place. And he saw the life beneath things rear its head just a little, a voice forming inside them, calling him forward to fulfill his purpose. Jensi passed back out of the crowd and circled around to the other side, began cautiously working his way up the steps, trying not to cause a disturbance. He kept his eyes open for other security in the crowd. There was nobody, obvious. Either there was nobody or somebody was undercover. There was Istvin's head and shoulders just a few steps above him. All I have to do is get to him, thought Jensi. If I can get to him and touch him, I'll be able to coax him out of doing whatever he's thinking of doing. But even as he thought this, Istvin lifted his head and began to move. Don't you think, a new reporter began to say, and then stopped when she saw Istvin suddenly dash toward the podium. The security man nearest to him had been caught napping too, and by the time he uncrossed his arm and began to retract, Istvin had kicked him hard in the knee. Even from where he was, pushing desperately forward through the crowd to try to get to his brother, Jensi heard the snap of the bone. The man went down in a heap with an unearthly cry. The other guard turned and rushed forward. He was now grappling with Istvin, trying to pull something out of his hand. Someone in the crowd started screaming, and suddenly everyone was fleeing down the stairs in the way. The flood of moving bodies carried Jensi along with it. He tried to resist the current, then turned and fell. Someone stepped on his hand hard, and somebody else tumbled over him and careened farther down the steps, and he had scrambled to his feet again and was rushing forward. He saw Istvin headbutt the guard, and he was struggling. He saw Istvin headbutt the guard he was struggling with. The man let go, stumbling back a little before falling down. Fisher now was crouched behind the podium, cowering, protecting his head with his hands. Istvin spun and pointed what was in his hand at the man, and Jensi realized it was a gun. Istvin, no! He shouted, but Istvin didn't seem to hear. He had a strange grin on his face. Strange because it did not seem malevolent or malicious, but only like the grin of someone who was playing a joke. And then he pulled the trigger, and there was a roar, and Councilman Fisher's head broke apart to spatter the podium. For a moment, the body swayed there, and then all the joints went loose and it collapsed. Istvin's face had changed. He was no longer grinning. Instead, he seemed genuinely shocked. He turned the gun around and brought it close to his face and stared into its barrel, as if it could tell him something. Then he lifted his head and suddenly met his brother's gaze, and this time seemed to see him. Shaking his head, he said, "This is not my purpose." "Put the gun down," said Jensi. "Please." But Istvin kept holding it. "Brother," he pleaded, "help me." Istvin took a step forward, but it was already too late. The second security guard had regained his feet and plowed into Istvin, knocking him down. The gun clattered away. Istvin didn't resist. He allowed the man to force his head against the concrete and hold it there while he zip-tied first his arms and then his legs. And Jensi, watching all of this, remembered above all else the way that Istvin's expression remained puzzled, confused. "Who are you?" shouted one of the reporters who had remained behind, but Istvin didn't answer. Jensi tried to get close, but the security guard waved him back, and when he kept on coming, pulled out a pistol, threatened him. "If I need to, I'll have you taken away along with him," he said. The other security guard was still lying on the ground, groaning, holding his leg. "Why did you do it?" asked one of the few people who had stayed, apparently a reporter. "No vids," said the security guard, brandishing the gun, but more than a few people were already taking them with their mobiles. This time Istvin did speak. He licked his lips and said, softly enough that Jensi himself could barely hear, "My purpose. But no, it wasn't. It was wrong." "What was that?" asked the reporter. "Speak up." "Shut up," said the guard, and kicked Istvin in the ribs. "Who gave you your purpose?" asked Jensi. "They did," said Istvin. "I told you to shut up," said the guard. "What is it you want to tell the world?" asked the reporter. "All eyes are on you now. What do you want the world to know?" "Who's they? Who gave you your purpose?" said Jensi again. "They did," said Istvin, and grimaced. A moment later, the steps were flooded by SCAC officers in riot gear, and Jensi wondered fleetingly if they were the they that Istvin had been talking about. One of them was in front of Jensi now, pushing him back and down the steps. The others moved rapidly to establish a perimeter. Jensi tried to resist and found himself pushed over and clattering down the steps. Through the gap between the officer's legs, he caught a brief glimpse of his brother's face, still as confused as ever, and then they had forced the bag over Istvin's head and were hustling him away. Eight. The news was in people's minds for a day or two, the subject of discussion on the vids, and then it disappeared almost as suddenly as it had first begun. Jensi had a hard time not thinking it had been deliberately quelled. For a week or two, you could find the vid if you looked hard enough, hiding in some of the backwaters of the system. It showed nothing of the assassination itself, since the kill shot had been hidden by the podium. No, you had to be to one side as Jensi had been to see Fisher's head burst and scatter blood and brain. What you did see was a look of confusion on Istvin's face directly after the shot. A confusion and puzzlement that continued well after he'd been knocked down and tied up. Jensi kept whirling the footage back, looking at it, trying to understand exactly what had happened. Was it simply an indication that Istvin had come out of his fantasy world? Was now realizing that the blood and brains were real? Had he convinced himself that the gun, when fired, would do something else? Or had he, in fact, been told that the gun would do something else? Fire blanks, fire a flag, not fire at all. Was it a question of Istvin's madness? Or had he been set up? And more importantly, was there any way in which watching the vid to know for certain? After a few dozen viewings, Jensi guessed not. He might, he realized, never had a clear handle on what happened to his brother. Yet he could not stop himself from continuing to watch the vid, continuing to hope that this time, by slowing the footage down to a crawl, he'd see something that he had missed before. Henry had shown up shortly after they had carted Istvin away, when Jensi was still standing there at the scene, trying to take in what had happened. "I came as fast as I could," he claimed, as soon as he saw it on the vids. "As soon as I saw it on the vids. I'm so sorry." Without Henry, Jency did not know how long he might have gone standing there, shocked, but he let Henry gather him around the shoulders and lead him away. Back in his apartment, he slept the sleep of the dead, not waking up for almost 20 hours. When he did, he found Henry still there, asleep on the couch. Once Henry realized he was awake, he roused himself and made Jency something to eat. "I've been asking about him," said Henry, trying to find out what they were going to do with him. Jency nodded listlessly. "They arrested him," he said. I was there. I saw it. He shot the man. What other choice did they have?" Henry shook his head. "They took him away, but they didn't arrest him." "What?" "No, he's not at the police station or in any holding facility." Sorry. "He's not at any police station or in any holding facility I could locate. Or if he is, they won't tell me. Since you're a relative, you might have better luck." When he began contacting people, he had the same results, or lack thereof, as Henry. Nobody in the police station admitted any knowledge of Istvin. None of the facilities in the incarceration dome had received him either. "But he has to be somewhere," said Jency to a prison representative on the other end of the line. "No doubt he is somewhere," she said acidly, "but he isn't here." And then she broke the connection. They tried again. Henry called his father and got him to talk to an acquaintance on the police force. He reported to Jency that yes, there had been a man brought in with a bag over his head, surrounded by SCAC forces. But almost as soon as he had arrived, he had been taken away again. He didn't know where or why. This wasn't, he made clear to Henry's dad, standard procedure. The man promised to ask around if he could do so without raising too many hackles. See what he could find out. After that, they didn't know what else to do. They sat silent for a while, trying to come up with other ideas of how to locate Istvin. "Maybe they killed him," Jency finally said, breaking the silence. And then, when Henry didn't contradict him, said, "Say something. Did they?" Slowly, Henry shook his head. "I don't think so," he said. "It doesn't seem like a smart move on their part, particularly with the vids still available. But they seem to be getting rid of the vids. They can't get rid of all of them. They don't know who has them on private systems. It could come back to haunt them. It's not in their best interest to kill him unless they're sure he won't be needed later. I don't think they could possibly know that yet." "But you think it's possible they killed him?" asked Jency. Henry nodded. "It's possible," he admitted. He took sick leave. He watched the vids over and over, still looking, still searching for something that would mean anything. If only he'd tried to keep Istvin from leaving. Maybe if he hadn't been as tired as he was, he'd have managed to do that. But then again, maybe not. Or if he'd asked Istvin more questions, tried to coax what he meant out of him, then even if he hadn't managed to get him to stay, Jency would have more of a sense of what he meant by his purpose and of who they were. Or maybe, he couldn't help but think, even though he didn't want to, I couldn't have done anything to make any difference at all. When Henry's father showed up at Jency's door, it was only to tell him that his contacts hadn't been able to find anything out. Nobody seemed to know anything at all, though it was clear that a higher authority was at work. Maybe even that Istvin was no longer on the planet. "No longer on the planet?" asked Jency. "How can he stand trial if he's not here?" Henry's father fell silent. "He can't," he finally said. "And he probably won't." "What do you mean won't?" "He's a political prisoner, an enemy of the state," said Henry's father. The rules don't apply to him in the same way. The law applies to everybody the same, said Jency. Henry's father reached out and squeezed his shoulder. Surely you've been around long enough that you can't actually believe that, he said. Your brother has been taken away somewhere secret, somewhere where the laws don't apply. There, they'll torture him until he tells them whatever they want to know about why he did what he did. After that, they'll imprison him in an undisclosed location. He gave Jancy a look of pity. In all likelihood, you'll never see your brother again. But still, even having been told that, he couldn't help but try. He went to the police station, inquired after his brother, and when they turned him away and told him Ispen wasn't there, he simply returned again the next day. He kept coming. They kept turning him away, and finally they told him that he couldn't come anymore. He insisted on seeing the chief of police, who also claimed to have no idea what had happened with his brother, claimed that the police had nothing to do with it, but did actually listen to him. When he had finished and the police chief was still shaking his head, Jency asked, "Who do I have to talk to next?" The police chief was happy to send him up to the superintendent, just to get rid of him. From there, he got shuffled between politicians and the military, one sending him to the other and vice versa for a while, like a ricocheting bullet, until finally a councilman named Richard Savage was staring across the table at him and asking him to repeat the story one more time. And once he took pity on him. "Do you have a lawyer?" Savage asked him. Jency shook his head. "If you had one," said Savage, "he might be able to cut through some of this red tape." He didn't have enough money for a lawyer, but he got one anyway. A young independent fellow named Lee Tompkins, who was more interested in the politics of the case than in any money he might earn. Even with the lawyer, it took a while, more shunting and shuttling, but finally, he and Tompkins were in an office with a military official by the name of Brannan. "What brings you here?" asked Brannan. He had clear, pale eyes and a steady gaze, and a stony face that gave very little away. "You know why we're here," said Tompkins, began to unload signed and stamped forms from his bag. He placed them on the desk, but Brannan ignored them. "We followed protocols," said Tompkins. "We've done everything the law requires of us. Now you are required to tell us where this man's brother is." "That information is classified," said Brannan. "We have all the approvals," said Tompkins steadily. "You can't stonewall us." "I'm not stonewalling," said Brannan. "I'm just not in a position to answer your question." He leaned back in his chair, tented his fingers. "I can admit we have his brother, but he is a political prisoner." "My brother doesn't have a political bone in his body," said Jency. Brannan shrugged. "He killed a politician at a public ceremony," he said. "He's political." "It's all a misunderstanding," said Jency. "There's something not right about him. He didn't know what he was doing. He shouldn't be in jail. He should be in a facility somewhere he can get help." "He isn't in jail," said Brannan. "He is in a containment center." "Where?" "I can't say where." Where? "I can't say where. That's classified information." "How can you take someone off without even a trial and hide them in a containment center where nobody knows where they are?" Brannan didn't answer. "Is it off-world?" "I can't answer that," said Brannan. "What can you answer?" "I can tell you that we have your brother. I can tell you that he is still alive. I can tell you as well that he will not be released anytime soon. Perhaps ever." Jency shook his head. "Who else can I talk to?" he asked. "Nobody else," said Brannan. "I'm the end of the line. I'm sorry, but this is as much as you're ever going to know." Jency turned to Tompkins. The lawyer nodded. I'm afraid he's right. Next step is the courts. We can file a suit, but it'll take years, it'll take years for it even to get heard. For all intents and purposes, we've run out of possibilities. Jensi kept trying, even after Tompkins drifted away and on to other cases, but he realized more with each passing day how hopeless it was. Eventually, it became almost a hobby, a way of stirring things up a little, even though he knew there was no hope. He returned to picking, slowly started thinking of his brother less and less, and when he did think of him, it was with a twinge of guilt and pain. But he had his own life to live. He had to keep on. Henry just squeaked by in school, then left off to work off-world for a while, the plan being to get a job that would let him build up some quick capital, then return and invest in real estate. Jensi was sorry to see him go. After that, it was just him and picking and lying around his apartment. Occasionally an evening out with an acquaintance or a friend, or wandering the streets late at night, alone, stumbling through endless self-accusations, making vows to himself about what he would do to get his brother back. But part of him wondered if he would ever see his brother again. And deep inside, he knew the chances weren't good. He would have to learn to live with that fact. He would have to learn to move forward alone. All right, so that finishes part 1, chapter 5 to 8. Next would be part 2, which what I have scheduled is Tuesday, but of course that depends how my work is. But again, as I expected, this was going to be a shorter reading session. And next chapter part 2 is actually really short as well. So either way, thank you for liking if you like. Thank you for commenting if you commented. Thank you for subscribing if you subscribed. Thank you for favoriting if you favorited. Thank you for simply clicking on this video. Until next time, guys, see ya and stream.